She was elbow deep in a dying man's chest when the blow came. Not a shove, not a warning. A full, open-handed slap. The kind that snaps a head sideways and rings in your ears for 3 days. The emergency ward went dead silent. Doctors froze mid-sentence. Nurses stopped breathing. Even the monitors seemed to pause. Colonel Victor Hale stood there, silver eagles on his collar, contempt in his eyes, and the entire room just watched. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. And the woman standing there with blood on her scrubs and fire in her eyes, she had a secret that would eventually bring his entire empire down. If you're new here, hit follow, drop a like, and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, stay with me, because this one doesn't let go. The North Point Regional Medical Center smelled the same every night. Antiseptic, old coffee, something underneath both of those things that nobody ever named, but everyone recognized. The specific heavy scent of people in the worst moments of their lives. Hannah Mercer had worked the night shift in the emergency department for 4 years. She knew every sound the building made. The particular groan of the elevator on the 3rd floor that always stuck between levels. The way the fluorescent light above Bay 7 flickered exactly twice before stabilizing. The difference between the footsteps of someone who belonged here and someone who was about to cause a problem. She was resetting a tray table in Bay 3 when she heard the second set. Heavy, deliberate. The kind of stride that expected the floor to get out of its way. She didn't look up immediately. She was annotating a medication chart for a 62-year-old man named Gerald Avery, who'd come in 40 minutes ago with chest compressions already in progress and was now somehow miraculously stable. Probably not for long. Definitely not without continuous monitoring. The chart needed to be exact. She finished the notation, then she looked up. The man in the doorway was broad-shouldered and dressed in a service uniform. Army green, pressed to geometric perfection, silver insignia catching the fluorescent light. He was somewhere in his mid-50s with the kind of jaw that suggested he'd spent decades making other men nervous. Behind him, 2 junior officers in AC-US stood in loose formation, eyes forward, and between them, half supported by one of the juniors, was a young soldier. Early 20s, pale, left arm cradled against his chest, jaw set against whatever pain he was managing. Hannah's eyes went to the soldier first. Always the patient first. Laceration on the forearm, maybe deep. Possible fracture from the way he was guarding it. Losing color. Not emergent, but not nothing either. The man in charge spoke before she could open her mouth. "I need my man seen. Now." His voice had the particular texture of someone who'd never been told to wait. Hannah set down the chart carefully. "Sir, I'll get someone over to triage him within—" "I didn't ask for triage." He took 2 steps into the bay. "I said now." She kept her voice level. "I understand. And we will see him. But I need you to check in at the front desk so we can—" "Do you know who I am?" The question landed in the room the way those questions always did, like a stone dropped in still water, expecting ripples. Hannah looked at him directly. "I don't, sir, but I do know that the man in this bay had a cardiac event 40 minutes ago and is currently the most critical patient in this wing, so I need you to work with me here." A pause. His eyes moved from her to Gerald Avery's still form, to the monitors, to the IV lines, and then back to her face. Something calculated moved through his expression. He wasn't assessing the situation, he was assessing her, measuring how much resistance she was actually prepared to offer. "Get me your supervisor." "Of course." She reached for the intercom. "In the meantime, one of our nurses can begin preliminary." "I didn't come here to be triaged by a nurse." He said the word like it tasted like something beneath him. "Get me a physician. Get me your charge nurse. Get me someone with actual authority in this building." She pressed the intercom button. "Charge to Bay 3, please." "It is a... Bay 3, please." She released it and turned back to him. "Dr. Ellison will be with you in a few minutes. If you can take your man to the waiting area. We'll wait here. Sir, this is an active treatment bay. Then finish treating him and give us the space." Gerald Avery's monitor chirped once, a minor variation in rhythm. Probably nothing, could be something. Hannah's eyes flicked to the readout automatically, brain running the calculation in the background the way it always did, the way it had been doing for years without her really choosing to do it. The colonel noticed. "You're not even listening to me." "I'm doing 2 things at once, sir." She picked up the chart again. "That's generally how this department functions." He moved closer. She was aware of it the way you're aware of a change in air pressure. Not a sound exactly, just a shift. I want you removed from this bay. That's not your call to make. Everything in this building is my call to make. He said it with the absolute certainty of a man who had never had that statement seriously challenged. I've donated more money to this hospital's trauma wing than your annual salary. I've sat on funding committees with your board. Do you have any idea how fast I can make a phone call? She looked up from the chart. She met his eyes and she said, very quietly, then make it. What happened next took less than 3 seconds. Later, reviewing the security footage in an office that smelled of cold coffee and institutional dread, the investigators would time it. 2.8 seconds from the point Colonel Victor Hale raised his hand to the point his palm connected with Hannah Mercer's face. In the moment itself, it felt longer. The sound was wrong. That was the only word for it. In an emergency department, you heard painful things constantly. The sounds of procedures, of distress, of equipment. But the sharp, flat crack of an open hand against a human face carried differently. It cut through background noise the way a scream in a library cuts through silence. Hannah's head snapped sideways. Her shoulder hit the supply cart. A tray clattered, syringes scattering, and the sound of that plastic against tile was somehow the loudest thing that had happened in the last 30 seconds. She didn't fall. She braced against the cart, one hand gripping the edge, and stayed upright. The room didn't move. Dr. Yusuf Ellison was standing in the doorway of Bay 3. He had arrived just in time to see it happen. He was a 40-year-old emergency physician who had treated gunshot wounds and multi-vehicle crash survivors, and a man who had somehow swallowed an entire socket wrench set. He did not, in this moment, move. Neither did the 2 nurses at the station 12 feet away. Neither did the 3 other people visible in the hallway. Nobody moved. Colonel Hale straightened his uniform jacket. Just a small, habitual adjustment. The tug at the hem, the slight roll of the shoulders, like he'd just stood up from a chair at a long meeting. I don't have time for insubordination, he said. Not from civilians, not from anyone. He turned to one of his junior officers. Get Corporal Reyes to the front desk. We'll find someone competent. He walked out of the bay. Hannah's hand was still on the edge of the supply cart. She could feel the fluorescent light above her, the one that flickered twice, and it flickered once, and she counted the half second before the second flicker, and it came, and the light stabilized. Her face burned. That specific burn, not quite pain, not quite numbness, the body's confused first response to impact. She let go of the cart. She stood up straight. She looked at Dr. Ellison. He looked back at her. He didn't say anything. That silence, she would think later, was its own kind of verdict. They suspended her within the hour. She was still in the department, had gone back to Gerald Avery's bay, checked his rhythm, updated the chart, flagged the attending for a follow-up cardiology consult, when the charge nurse, a woman named Brenda Cho, who Hannah had worked beside for 3 years, appeared at her elbow with an expression that meant something administrative and terrible was coming. Hannah, Administrator Whitfield wants you upstairs. She knew. She could tell from Brenda's voice, not hostile, not warm, just careful. The voice you used when you were delivering news you'd already distanced yourself from. Now? He said immediately. She handed off Gerald Avery's chart to a colleague, stripped her gloves, washed her hands in the bay sink. She could see her reflection in the dark window above the sink, the fluorescent light casting the particular unflattering wash that made everyone look slightly unwell. On her left cheek, the redness was already deepening towards something visible. She took the elevator to the 4th floor. The administrative wing of North Point Regional was a different world, carpeted, quieter, smelling of air freshener instead of antiseptic. It existed behind a set of glass-paneled doors that felt intentionally separate from the wards below, which Hannah had always thought was a very specific design choice that said something true about institutional priorities. Administrator Whitfield was a tall man who wore expensive reading glasses and had the kind of professional pleasantness that functioned as a permanent shield against accountability. He gestured to a chair. She sat. He didn't sit. Hannah, I want you to know that what happened this evening was completely unacceptable. A pause. Regrettable. She waited. We're in a very complicated position. He put his hands in his pockets. Colonel Hale is a significant figure in the military community. He has long-standing relationships with this institution, and he struck me. I understand that. He nodded, a careful nod. And we're taking that seriously. But there are proper channels for these things, and in the meantime, while you investigate, we need to ensure that the department functions without additional tension, given the circumstances. He took off his reading glasses and polished them, a gesture that bought him approximately 4 seconds of not making eye contact. We're asking you to take a temporary leave, paid, obviously, just until it goes away. Hannah. He walked out of this building without anyone stopping him. His soldier went to triage, which is exactly what I told them to do. And you're suspending me. Whitfield put his glasses back on. It's a temporary. I heard you the first time. She stood up. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She didn't do the thing he was probably braced for, the raised voice or the threat or the breakdown. She just stood and picked up her badge and turned toward the door. Hannah. His voice shifted slightly, but not softer exactly, more careful. I hope you understand this isn't personal. She stopped. She didn't turn around. That's the part, she said. That's most interesting to me. She walked out. Her apartment was 12 minutes from the hospital. She drove there on autopilot, muscle memory navigating the streets while her brain ran on some separate, quieter track. The city outside the windows was the ordinary kind of alive it always was at this hour. Convenience stores lit up like small suns. A couple walking a large and unhurried dog. A bus pulling away from a stop in a cloud of exhaust. She parked. She sat in the car for a moment, her face still burned. She went inside, took off her shoes at the door the way she always did, walked to the kitchen. She filled a glass of water and stood at the counter and drank all of it in one slow, continuous effort. Then she put the glass down and stood there in the particular silence of an apartment that had only ever held one person, and she let herself feel the full weight of what the evening had actually been. Not the slap. The slap was almost simple in its way, clear, cause and effect. A man who believed he existed above consequences had expressed that belief physically. She'd been on the receiving end. That was straightforward. What was less straightforward was the room full of people who hadn't moved. Ellison standing in the doorway, Brenda at the station, the nurses, the other staff, the peripheral witnesses. Not one of them had stepped forward. Not one of them had said a word. Not even after, when it was over, when Hale had walked out and the department had exhaled its collective held breath. Nobody had come to check on her. She'd checked her own chart. She'd gone back to Gerald Avery. She put her palms flat on the counter and looked at the window over the kitchen sink, which reflected the room back at her in dark glass. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Unknown number. She declined. It buzzed again. Same number. She picked up. Mercer. A man's voice. Not someone she knew. Who is this? You're going to want to sit down for this conversation. She looked at the window. Her reflection looked back, expression unreadable. I'm standing, she said. A brief pause, then, my name is Commander Nathan Drake. I'm about 20 minutes out from Ashford Ridge. There's something we need to discuss. Something that can't wait and can't happen over the phone. His voice was measured, professional. Not warm, but not cold either. Just the specific, clipped precision of someone accustomed to communicating under conditions where clarity mattered more than feeling. I know this is a bad time. What do you know about my time? Another pause, shorter. More than you'd expect, he said. And less than I'd like. That's part of why I'm calling. Hannah's eyes tracked to the mark on her face, visible even in the dark reflection, redder than it had been an hour ago, going to bruise. She thought about the suspended badge in her jacket pocket, about Whitfield's careful, cowardly nod. What's this about, Commander? A file, he said, with your name on it. It was sealed for a long time, a beat. Someone opened it tonight. She said nothing. Outside, somewhere in the city, she heard the distant sound she'd been trained to recognize before she'd become a nurse, before she'd built a careful, ordinary life on top of everything she'd left behind. The low, rhythmic chop of a military helicopter's rotors. Getting closer. Her hand tightened on the phone. It was sealed for a reason, she said. I know. And whoever opened it, that's exactly what we need to talk about. She walked to the window. The night sky over Ashford Ridge was clear, the lights of the city cutting upward. She could see it now, a dark shape moving against the stars, steady and deliberate, navigating by something she couldn't see from here. Coming toward the city. Coming toward the hospital, by the look of the angle. 20 minutes, she said. Maybe 15 now. She set the glass down on the windowsill. She reached for her jacket. She was halfway back to her car when the ground shook. Not an earthquake. This was sharper, more directional. A percussion from the east, from the direction of the Greystone River corridor, deep enough that she felt it in her sternum rather than her feet. She stopped on the sidewalk. For 2 full seconds, the city seemed to hold a single collective breath. Then her phone exploded. Not the unknown number, her personal contacts. 3 simultaneous calls, notification banners stacking. She swept them aside, opened the emergency alert that was already pushing through from the city system. Major structural failure. Greystone River Bridge. Multiple casualties reported. All available medical personnel. She was already running before she finished reading it. The bridge. The Greystone River Bridge was the main artery connecting the east and west sides of Ashford Ridge, a 6-lane crossing that handled rush-hour traffic from 3 different suburbs. Whatever had happened at the worst possible hour, when the bridge would have been carrying maximum load, which meant the tally wouldn't be small. She got in the car. She didn't think about the suspension. She thought about Gerald Avery's chart and the chaos that was about to hit the emergency department and the fact that she knew that ward better than anyone on the floor tonight. She drove. She drove through streets that were already transforming around her. Police vehicles pushing through intersections, an ambulance cutting a path down the wrong side of the road. Civilians on the sidewalk stopping to look east with phones raised. The sound of the city changing registers in real time. When she pulled into the hospital lot, she could already see it. The triage tents being unrolled outside the main entrance, the emergency personnel moving in and out of the building with the specific urgency that meant things were bad and getting worse. Someone was shouting directions through a megaphone that nobody seemed to be following. She pushed through the main doors. The emergency department was, she had no better word for it, drowning. Gurneys in the hallway, staff running with equipment, a family clustered in a corner, the mother holding a child and rocking, the child very still. A man in construction clothes sitting against a wall staring at his hands, which were covered in someone else's blood. The charge desk had 3 people trying to talk at once, and not one of them was actually moving anything forward. Nobody noticed her come in. Or if they did, they didn't stop her. She grabbed a set of gloves from the dispenser at the entrance and snapped them on. She walked to the center of the department. She raised her voice. Not a yell, not a plea. The particular register she'd developed a long time ago, in circumstances that most of the people in this room would never fully understand, the voice calibrated to cut through noise and panic and competing information and reach the part of a person's brain that was still capable of following a clear direction. "Listen up," she said. "Right now, everybody." Heads turned, not all at once. It was never all at once, but one by one, the way a field of grass bends when the wind finally arrives. We're going to divide this floor into 4 zones. Zone 1 is your most critical. Cardiac, airway, uncontrolled hemorrhage. They go to bays 1 through 4 and they get a physician. Zone 2 is your serious but stable. Fractures, lacerations, blunt trauma, bays 5 through 12, nurse-led with physician rotation. Zone 3 is walking wounded. Hallway right, we set up 2 additional stations. Zone 4 is psychological. Anyone who's physically uninjured but not functioning, family members, bystanders. East waiting room. Get me someone from psych on the phone now. A beat. If you don't have an assignment, you have one now. Dr. Ellison. She made eye contact with him across the room, the same man who had stood in the doorway of Bay 3 and done nothing. "You're taking Zone 1. I need your best 2 residents with you. Can you do that?" Ellison looked at her. 2 seconds of something complicated moved through his expression. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I can do that." "Then go." He went. She was already moving to the next problem before he cleared the doorway. A nurse with a supply cart who was frozen in the middle of the hallway, trying to determine which direction to push it. "What's in there?" "Wound care, sutures, some IV setup." Zone 2. Hannah took one end of the cart. "Come on." The next 4 hours happened in pieces. Later, she would remember it in fragments, the way memory always parceled out high-intensity periods, refusing to process them as continuous experience. The young soldier she triaged near the entrance with a crush injury to his right leg, counting his pulse with 2 fingers against his wrist and making the calculation about tourniquet timing before she'd consciously made the decision. A woman in her 40s who kept saying her daughter's name and had a head injury she didn't know about. The confusion presenting as calm. 3 people from the same vehicle, the driver with minor lacerations. Both passengers significantly worse, the driver who couldn't understand why he was sitting in a chair instead of being treated. She moved between zones. She redirected. She made calls. She asked Dr. Ellison once for his judgment on a presentation she wasn't certain about, and he gave it without the hesitation that had been there earlier. And it was a good call. And she told him so. She didn't eat. She didn't sit down. At some point, she became aware that people were following her instructions without needing to check with anyone else first, which was either organizational efficiency or something more complicated about the nature of authority in a crisis. And she didn't have time to think about which one. She just kept moving. It was somewhere past midnight when she became aware of the sound outside. She was at the charge desk, updating a triage log, when the distinctive rhythm pushed through the ambient noise of the department, cutting through it the way a specific frequency cuts through static when you know what to listen for. Rotors, close, getting closer. Not the news helicopters that had been circling the area since the collapse. This was lower, more purposeful. Military make. The specific acoustic signature of a UH-60 variant. The sound shaped differently by the rotor configuration. A distinction she hadn't consciously kept, but apparently never lost. It set down in the hospital's rooftop pad, and she heard the motor pitch change as it came to rest. She turned back to the triage log. She finished the entry. 2 minutes later, the elevator opened and a man she didn't immediately recognize walked through the emergency department doors wearing civilian clothes that didn't quite conceal the posture underneath them. Medium height, late 30s maybe. He moved through the crowded hallway with the kind of environmental awareness that had nothing to do with looking around. The way trained people navigated spaces, reading a room through peripheral vision and body geometry without advertising that they were doing it. He was carrying a sealed document case. He stopped in the middle of the department and looked around until he found her. He looked at her the way someone looks at a person they already know from a photograph, recognition without familiarity. He walked straight to her. Mercer. She looked at him over the triage log. Drake, she said. He set the document case down on the edge of the charge desk. We need to talk, he said, privately. She looked around the department, still full, still moving, but the worst of the chaos had passed through its peak. The triage system was holding. Dr. Ellison had Zone 1 running clean. 5 minutes, she said. I'll take what I can get. She led him to the supply room off the main corridor, the only space in the department she could guarantee would be empty. She pulled the door shut. The noise of the ward dropped to a muffled hum. Drake set the case on a shelf and clicked it open. Inside were documents, real documents, paper, with the kind of classification markings that most people saw in movies and assumed were exaggerated. They weren't exaggerated. She looked at the top sheet. She looked at her own name. Operation Meridian, the header read. And below it a date, 8 years ago, and a unit designation that she hadn't seen written anywhere in almost a decade. Someone pulled this tonight, Drake said, 30 minutes after the incident in Bay 3. She kept her eyes on the documents. Who? That's what I'm trying to find out. He paused. What I can tell you is that the person who opened this file has significant reach, and right now, they're not using it to help you. She looked up. Outside the supply room door, she could hear the department, the voices, the equipment, the ongoing, ordinary, extraordinary business of keeping people alive. Her left cheek still ached. The bruise would be fully visible by morning. What's in the rest of it? She asked. Drake looked at her steadily. Everything, he said. Everything you spent 8 years making sure nobody would find. The supply room was very quiet. Her hands were still. Her expression didn't change. But something shifted, something deep and tectonic. The specific sensation of a thing that has been buried for a long time beginning, against all intention, to move toward the surface. Close the case, she said. Hannah, close it. Her voice was flat. Not angry, just final. Not here, not tonight. She looked at the door. There are still people out there who need help. He looked at her for a moment, then he closed the case. She put her hand on the door. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow, he agreed. She walked back out into the noise. And somewhere across the city, in a building full of people who already knew what was coming, a colonel who had never in his life faced a real consequence sat in his office and looked at a phone call he hadn't returned. And for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't sure he should. She walked back out into the noise, and the noise swallowed her whole. That was how it always worked. The work was the only thing that reliably absorbed everything else. Grief, rage, humiliation. The particular cold weight of a sealed document case sitting on a supply room shelf with her name on the cover, You moved your hands, you made decisions, you kept going. The body's demand for forward motion was, in certain circumstances, the most merciful thing about being alive. The emergency department at 2 in the morning looked nothing like it had at midnight. The acute surge had crested and begun its slow recession. Gurneys that had been stacked 3 deep in the hallway now had breathing room between them. The shouting had given way to the lower, more focused communication of people working a problem they'd gotten their arms around. The megaphone from outside had gone silent. Someone had figured out the triage tents. Hannah moved through it all with the specific efficiency of exhaustion that had burned past feeling tired into something that functioned like clarity. She checked charts. She confirmed handoffs. She found a first-year resident named Campos standing outside Bay 7 with the expression of someone who had just encountered something textbook knowledge had not adequately prepared him for, and she walked him through it, step by step, until his hands stopped shaking and he went back in. She didn't think about Drake. She didn't think about the case. She thought about the next patient and then the one after that. It was close to 3 in the morning when Dr. Ellison found her at the sink in Bay 4, washing her hands for what felt like the 40th time that night. He stood in the doorway. He didn't say anything for a moment. "The zone system worked," he said finally. "Yes." Another pause. "Where'd you learn to run triage like that?" She dried her hands. "Experience." He accepted that the way people accepted answers that weren't answers when they didn't have the energy to push further. He leaned against the doorframe, and for a moment he looked less like the department physician and more like what he actually was at 3 in the morning. A man who'd been running on adrenaline for 6 hours and was beginning to feel the bottom of it. "For what it's worth," he said. "What happened earlier, in Bay 3? He stopped. She looked at him. "I should have said something," he said. "When it happened, I should have..." He made a gesture with one hand that meant nothing specific and everything approximate. "I didn't." She considered several responses. She chose the honest one. "No, you didn't." He held her gaze for a beat and then looked at the floor. "I know." It wasn't an absolution. She didn't offer one. But she let the silence settle without adding anything to it, which was its own kind of answer, and he seemed to understand that. He pushed off the doorframe. "You shouldn't even be here right now. You're suspended." "I know. Whitfield's going to hear about this." "I know that too." He looked at her for another moment. "You probably saved a dozen lives tonight." "Probably more," she said, not pride, just arithmetic. He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way. "Get some rest, Mercer." He walked away down the hall, and she watched him go, and then she turned back to the sink and looked at the dark window above it. Her reflection again, same as it had been 6 hours ago, except the bruise on her left cheek had fully developed now, a dark, unmistakable bloom spreading from the cheekbone down toward the jaw. She touched it with 2 fingers. She didn't wince. She turned off the tap and went to find Drake. He was still in the supply room. She almost expected him to be gone, to find the shelf empty, the case taken, the whole encounter reassigned to the category of things she might have imagined during a long shift. But he was there, sitting on an overturned supply crate, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbows, reading through something on a secured tablet. He looked up when she pushed the door open. "You look terrible," he said. "You've been sitting in a supply closet for 4 hours. Supply room," he said. "There's a distinction." She pulled the door shut behind her. She sat on the edge of a shelf across from him and crossed her arms, and the fluorescent tube above them hummed the way fluorescent tubes always did, a frequency just above the threshold of conscious irritation. "Talk," she said. He set the tablet down. He reached for the case, clicked it open, and turned it so she could see the contents again. She didn't look down at it yet. 8 days ago, he said, an analyst at the Defense Intelligence Review Division flagged a data access anomaly. A file cluster that had been inactive for 7 years registered a query. Someone ran a search using a name string. He paused. "Your name. Your previous designation." "What previous designation?" It wasn't a question. The flatness of it told him she knew exactly what he meant and was making him say it anyway. "Medical Operations, Special Programs Division, code word Meridian." He said it at the same level volume as everything else, like it was ordinary information. "You were assigned to the program under an alias for 3 years before your separation. The work you did there was classified above the level most senior officers in this building will ever see in their careers." She looked at the ceiling. The program was about trauma response optimization under mass casualty field conditions. We get to hear. He continued. You developed triage protocols that reduced treatment time per critical patient by a factor that still gets cited in internal DoD reports, except your name's been removed and replaced with the program's administrative designator. You also designed the field communication matrix that 3 different combat surgical teams still use, probably without knowing where it came from. It came from a lot of people, she said. I wasn't alone in that program. You were the primary architect of the response framework. I was 24 years old and I had a lot of help. And at 27, he said, you walked away, filed for separation, went quiet, and 6 months later, you turned up as a nurse at a regional hospital in Ashford Ridge. No forwarding information, no contact with anyone from the program. She lowered her gaze from the ceiling and looked at him directly. There was a reason for that. I know there was. His voice stayed even. Part of it's in the file, part of it isn't, which is the part I'm most interested in. She didn't respond to that. Someone accessed your file using a query protocol that requires senior-level clearance, he said. Not analyst tier, not mid-grade, senior access. And the timestamp on that access is 31 minutes after Colonel Victor Hale walked out of your emergency department. The fluorescent tube hummed. That's not a coincidence, she said. I don't believe it is. What are you telling me, Drake? That Hale ran my name? I'm telling you, someone with his level of clearance or connection to someone at that level ran your name inside of an hour of your confrontation with him. She let that sit for a moment, turned it over. He could have been trying to find leverage, running a background check through a channel that could tell him something a standard database wouldn't. That's possible. Or someone who works with him or for him anticipated the confrontation becoming a problem and wanted to know what they were dealing with. Also possible. Or, she stopped. Or, Drake said quietly, the confrontation wasn't random. She looked at him. He met her eyes and held them. Hale has been in Ashford Ridge for 6 weeks on a temporary assignment related to a base integration review. His unit has been through 4 different regions in the last 2 years. Complaints from 3 of those regions sit in an IG file that has been reviewed and closed twice without action. What kind of complaints? Misconduct, intimidation, abuse of authority. 1 allegation of physical assault from a civilian contractor at Fort Regan that was reclassified as an equipment incident within 72 hours of filing. Hannah was quiet. He's done this before, she said. Not a question. The pattern suggests he's done it consistently, Drake said, and consistently walked away from it because of who he knows, what he controls, and who has historically decided it wasn't worth the cost to push back. She looked down at the document case, at the file with her name on it, at the years it represented. Not just hers, but everyone's. The whole weight of a system that had protected the wrong people for so long that it had started to believe that was the natural order of things. So what do you want from me? She asked. Drake folded his hands. I want you to understand what's happening. Someone accessed your file, which means someone knows who you actually are. That's either an attempt to find something to use against you, or, he paused, or it's the beginning of something being dismantled. You're being cryptic. I'm being careful. He picked up the tablet again. There are people inside the system who have wanted to move on Hale for 2 years. The problem has always been the same. No incident with enough public weight to force the question into the open. Something that can't be reclassified or buried in administrative review. He looked at her steadily. Tonight, on camera, in a room full of witnesses, he struck a medical professional during an active treatment situation at a civilian hospital. And everyone in that room stayed quiet. Tonight they did. They'll stay quiet tomorrow too. Some of them will. He set the tablet face down on the supply crate. Some of them won't, if the right questions get asked by the right people. That's how these things work. The first person to talk makes it possible for the second, and the second makes the third not feel alone. He watched her face. You know how this works, Mercer. You've been in rooms where silence was the only thing keeping a bad situation together. She knew. She didn't say so. I'm not your weapon, she said. I'm not asking you to be. Then what are you asking? He was quiet for a moment. I'm asking you not to disappear again. The room held that. She stood up from the shelf, and the movement was slower than it would have been 12 hours ago. the body settling its accounts, presenting its invoice for the night. Her feet ached, her cheek ached. Something behind her sternum ached that had nothing to do with physical impact. "I'm going home," she said. "I'm going to sleep for a few hours, and then we're going to talk again. And you're going to tell me everything that's in that file and everything that isn't. And I'm going to decide what I think about all of it." "That's fair." "It's not about fair. It's just what's going to happen." She picked up her jacket from where she'd left it on a shelf 3 hours ago. "Where are you staying?" "Hotel Meridian on 5th. He paused. "The name's a coincidence." "Is it?" He almost smiled. "No." She looked at him for a moment, this careful, measured man who had flown into her city in the middle of the night carrying a case full of years she'd spent a long time burying. She tried to read him the way she read everyone, looking at what the body said when the mouth was being selective. He was controlled, but not in the way of someone hiding something specifically threatening. More like the control of someone who dealt routinely in information that had weight and had learned to carry it without telegraphing the load. She didn't trust him. She didn't distrust him. She filed him in the category of things that required more data. "Don't go anywhere," she said. She left the supply room and walked back through the emergency department, which was calmer now. Not quiet, never fully quiet, but operating at something approaching its baseline rhythm. A few of the overnight staff noticed her leaving. Nobody stopped her. The badge that had been suspended from her jacket pocket was still there. She could feel its specific small weight against her hip, but she'd been working without it all night, and the department had functioned. And somehow that felt like its own kind of commentary on what authority actually meant versus what institutions said it. She pushed through the main doors. The air outside was cool and carried the faint smell of river water. The Greystone, somewhere to the east, still carrying whatever the collapsed bridge had put into it. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked at the sky, which was doing the particular thing skies did in cities at 4 a.m. Not dark exactly, but that deep blue-grey that suggested darkness rather than committing to it. She was too tired for the drive to feel like anything. She made it anyway. Her apartment was exactly as she'd left it. Glass on the windowsill, jacket on the hook she hadn't put it on because she'd grabbed it and run. She picked the glass up and rinsed it and set it in the drying rack. She sat on the edge of the bed. She thought about the document case, about her name on the cover and what was underneath it, not just the official record, the program designations and the protocol frameworks and the clearance levels, but what those things stood for. The 3 years she'd given to a program that had taken a great deal and given back something she still wasn't sure how to categorize. The specific incidents that had made leaving feel not just necessary but urgent. The way you could believe completely in the value of something and simultaneously know that you had to leave it before it cost you something you couldn't get back. She'd spent 8 years making sure that version of herself was separate, compartmentalized. Nurse Hannah Mercer and whatever she'd been before existed in different files, different registers, different rooms of her own architecture. Someone had connected those rooms tonight. She lay back on the bed without taking her shoes off. She was asleep in 4 minutes. Her phone rang at 7:13. She was awake before the second ring. Not the gradual surfacing of civilian sleep, but the immediate transition of someone whose nervous system had been trained to treat the sound of interruption as a signal rather than an intrusion. She looked at the screen. Not Drake. Not an unknown number. Brenda Cho. She answered. "Brenda." "Hannah." Brenda's voice was careful in that way it had been last night outside Bay 3, the administrative news voice. But underneath it something else. Something that sounded more like uncertainty than caution. "There's something you need to know." She sat up. "What happened?" "Whitfield called an emergency meeting this morning, 7 o'clock, senior staff, department heads, board liaison." A pause. "He's moving to make the suspension formal. Paperwork for a conduct review. They're saying..." Brenda stopped. "They're saying you interfered with departmental operations during a critical incident, coming back while suspended, taking command of triage without authorization." Without authorization. Hannah let the words sit in her mouth for a moment. "People would have died, Brenda." "I know that." "How many came through last night?" 63 patients from the bridge, 4 critical. All 4 are stable this morning." 4 critical, all stable, in a department that was drowning when I walked in." "I know," Brenda said again, and the third time the words sounded different from the first, heavier, more specific. "That's why I'm calling you, because there are people here who know what last night actually was, what you actually did, she paused, and there are people here who are going to be asked to say otherwise. Hannah stood up and walked to the window. The morning outside was ordinary. The street, the cars, a man walking a dog with the particular resigned shuffle of a pre-coffee existence. The world continuing its business with no regard for what was happening inside the buildings it moved between. "He's going to come after you again," Brenda said. "Whitfield. He got a call last night, Hannah. I don't know from who, but he was different after it." "What kind of different?" "Scared." The word came out plainly, without decoration. He looked scared. Hannah's eyes moved to the street below. Down on the sidewalk, across the road, a black vehicle was parked at a meter. Not unusual. The street had metered parking, but the vehicle had been there when she'd come home, and it was there now, and the windows were tinted in a way that was technically legal and practically said everything it needed to say about why it was there. She watched it. "Brenda," she said, keeping her voice even, "thank you for calling." "Hannah, I know what I'm walking into. Don't worry about me." She hung up. She stood at the window with the phone in her hand and watched the black vehicle not move. Then she went to make coffee, because the next several hours were going to require that she be awake, and because some mornings the most defiant thing you could do was start from the very beginning of an ordinary routine and refuse to let anyone else write the first line of your day. The coffee brewed, she drank it standing at the counter. She thought about Hale, sitting somewhere in this city. In his office or his quarters or a conference room with people who owed him things, beginning to understand that last night had not resolved the way he'd expected it to, that the woman he'd dismissed with a single motion of his hand had not stayed dismissed. She thought about the file with her name on it. She thought about what Drake had said. The first person to talk makes it possible for the second. She set down the cup. She picked up her phone and dialed. He answered on the first ring. "You're up early?" "I never really went down." She looked at the window, at the parked vehicle, at the ordinary street around it. "How fast can you get to me?" A brief pause. Not hesitation, just calculation. 20 minutes. "Make it 15, she said. "And Drake," she stopped for just a moment. "Bring the file." He was there in 13 minutes. She heard the car before she saw it. Not the black vehicle across the street, which hadn't moved, but a second car pulling to the curb 2 buildings down. A rental by the look of it, grey and anonymous. Drake got out carrying the document case and a paper coffee cup that suggested he'd had the presence of mind to stop somewhere on the way, which she filed as a mark in his favour. He didn't look at the black vehicle. He walked to her building entrance without breaking stride, which meant he'd already clocked it before he turned onto the street. She buzzed him up. He came through her apartment door and set the case on the kitchen table and handed her the second coffee without being asked. She took it. "The car's been there since before I got home," she said. "I know. It's a private contractor plate, security firm out of the Westfield district, not law enforcement." He sat down at the table without being invited to. Hale outsources surveillance when he doesn't want the action documented inside his chain of command. She sat across from him. "You've been watching him." "Long enough to know his methods." He clicked the case open. "The conduct review they're building against you. Whitfield filed the preliminary paperwork at 6:40 this morning, which means someone told him to do it before 7, which means someone was awake at 6 drafting the instruction." Hale. "Or someone acting for him." Drake pulled a sheet from the file and set it on the table between them. Not the classified documents from last night, but something printed more recently. A name, a phone record timestamp, a series of connection points mapped in the clean, cold logic of an investigation that had been running quietly for longer than last night. Whitfield received a call at 11:52 p.m., 40 minutes after the bridge casualties started arriving, 42 minutes after you walked back into that department and took command of triage. She looked at the document. "He called Whitfield in the middle of a mass casualty event," she said. "He called Whitfield while you were saving the people that event produced." Drake's voice stayed even. "That's the part I want you to sit with." She sat with it. It wasn't anger exactly that moved through her. It was something more structural. The specific sensation of a pattern becoming visible. The pieces assembling into a shape she recognized because she'd seen versions of it before. Not here. Not in Ashford Ridge, but in other places. Other institutions. Other rooms where powerful men had made phone calls in the middle of crises. They weren't managing because they were too busy managing the narrative around themselves. She picked up her coffee. "What's in the classified portion that I haven't seen yet?" Drake pulled the file toward him and opened it to a tabbed section toward the back. He didn't hand it to her immediately. He looked at it for a moment first, a specific kind of hesitation that wasn't uncertainty about whether to show her, but something more like the pause before you said something you knew would change the shape of a conversation permanently. "In the final 8 months of Meridian," he said, "there was an incident, a field evaluation exercise at a classified training installation. You were there as part of the program's assessment team. Something happened during the exercise that resulted in a formal inquiry." She was very still. The inquiry was conducted internally. The findings were sealed at the request of a senior officer who had jurisdiction over the program at the time. He finally turned the file toward her. That officer's name appears twice in connection with Victor Hale. Once as a character reference in a disciplinary file from 4 years later. Once as a co-signatory on a funding allocation that benefited a security contracting firm Hale has a silent stake in. She looked at the name in the file. She looked at it for a long time. "He buried the inquiry," she said, "and Hale was one of the people the inquiry would have implicated. That's why I left." She set the coffee down. "Not entirely, but that's part of it." "I know. You've known since before last night." "I suspected since before last night. The file confirmed it." He watched her carefully, the way you watched someone process something that had been stored under pressure for a long time and was now unavoidably moving. The inquiry concerned a failure of command protocol during the field exercise. 3 program members were injured. The assessment team's recommendations, your recommendations, were overridden by the senior officer on site. The overrides contributed directly to the injuries. 2 of them were serious, she said. Her voice was flat, precise. Marcus Tran had a perforated eardrum and a fractured orbital from a training breach that should never have happened if anyone had listened to the safety assessment. Yolanda Reyes, different Reyes, no relation to last night, was medevaced with a spinal compression that she spent 2 years rehabbing. She looked at the table. "I put both of those in writing beforehand. The assessment was complete. The protocol was clear. He overrode it because slowing down the exercise timeline was inconvenient and because I was 26 and he outranked everyone else in the room." Drake said nothing. "I filed the complaint the next day," she said. "I had documentation, I had witnesses, and within 3 weeks the inquiry was sealed. My complaint was reclassified as an administrative grievance, and I was informed by 2 separate people through 2 separate channels that my continued presence in the program was becoming a problem for program continuity." She looked up. "So I left on my own terms before they could remove me on theirs. I took a separation, I buried the designation, and I spent 6 months deciding who I wanted to be after that." "And you became a nurse in Ashford Ridge?" "I became a nurse in Ashford Ridge," she confirmed, "because the work was still the work, and the work was the only thing that had never let me down. Institutions let you down, hierarchies let you down. The work itself..." She stopped. "The work is just true. Either you do it right or someone suffers. There's no politics in the actual biology." Drake closed the file. "The person connected to Hale, the senior officer who sealed the inquiry, his name is General Arthur Klein. He retired 14 months ago. He is currently a board advisor for 2 defense contracting firms, one of which has a significant financial relationship with a hospital network that includes North Point Regional." The silence in the kitchen changed quality. "He's connected to this hospital," she said. "To the parent network, not directly to the building." Drake folded his hands on the table. "But Whitfield's appointment to the administrator position 3 years ago was endorsed by a board committee that Klein's firm had influence with." She stood up. She needed to move, not from agitation, but from the physical pressure of information that had too much mass to sit with while stationary. She walked to the window. The black vehicle was still there, patient as geology. "So Hale hits me," she said. "Someone accesses my file within the hour. Whitfield gets a call in the middle of the night. And now there's a conduct review designed to make me the problem." She turned from the window. "And all of it connects back to a sealed inquiry from 8 years ago that 2 people in this chain would very much prefer stayed sealed. That's the shape of it, yes? What do you want to do about it?" Drake looked at her steadily. "I want to open the inquiry." "You can't open a sealed military inquiry without new evidence or a triggering event significant enough to compel review." He reached back into the case and produced a second document, Thinner, recent, the paper still crisp. Last night was a triggering event. A credentialed medical professional assaulted by a military officer in a civilian facility on camera with multiple witnesses during a declared mass casualty response. He set the paper down. That's not something you can reclassify as an equipment incident. And when you open an inquiry into last night, you open a question about the pattern. And when you open a question about the pattern, everything underneath comes up with it. That's how it works. She looked at the document, at the clean administrative language of it, the formal request for review, the incident reference number that had been assigned to last night sometime in the small hours of the morning by someone in Drake's chain who had been waiting for exactly this. You need me to make a statement, she said. I need you to be willing to make one, officially, on record, with your real name and your real designation and your real history attached to it. She looked at him. Because a statement from a suspended nurse gets buried, he said quietly. But a statement from a former Meridian program architect with documented expertise in military trauma response, who was assaulted while actively managing a mass casualty event, who has existing knowledge of prior misconduct involving the same connected network. He stopped. That's a different document entirely. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a car passed. The black vehicle sat and waited. If I do this, she said, they're going to come at everything. My separation, the original complaint, the years between. Yes. They'll try to find something in the gap. They'll look. Whether they find something worth using depends on whether there's something there. She almost laughed, not at him, at the situation, at the specific irony of a man she'd known for less than 12 hours asking her to confirm the integrity of 8 years of her life, as though it was a reasonable question to answer standing in her kitchen at 7 in the morning. There's nothing there, she said. I went to work. I learned a different kind of medicine. I did the job. Then you have nothing to lose. That's not how this works, and you know it. I have everything to lose. My license, my position, what's left of it, my privacy. The version of my life I built deliberately and carefully. She looked at him. That's not nothing. No, he said. It isn't. The honesty of that landed differently than reassurance would have. She nodded once, slowly, and looked back at the window. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. Different from the one Drake had called from last night, but carrying the same quality of institutional anonymity. She answered it. Mercer. Ms. Mercer. Male voice. Not Hale. Someone more careful, smoother, with the professional warmth of someone accustomed to making uncomfortable calls sound collaborative. My name is Richard Sato. I'm with Whitfield Carroll Associates, and we're the legal counsel representing North Point Regional Medical Center. She said nothing. I'm calling as a courtesy, Sato continued, to let you know that the hospital will be proceeding with a formal conduct review regarding your actions last night. Given the circumstances, we believe it's in everyone's interest to handle this process quietly and efficiently. We'd like to schedule a preliminary conversation at your earliest. You're calling to tell me to be quiet, she said. A brief pause. We're calling to offer you the opportunity to participate in the process cooperatively, which we believe cooperatively. She repeated the word the same way she'd repeated without authorization 30 minutes ago, holding it up to the light and showing it what it actually was. Mr. Sato, last night, 63 people came through that emergency department from the Greystone Bridge collapse. 4 of them were critical. All 4 of them are alive this morning. She kept her voice level, unhurried. Would you like to tell me which part of that I should cooperate quietly about? Ms. Mercer, the hospital's position is... I'm not interested in the hospital's position at 7 in the morning. I'm interested in the truth, which is a different document entirely. She looked at Drake. He was watching her with the specific stillness of someone who had heard exactly what he needed to hear. I'll be in touch with you, Mr. Sato, through my own representation. She hung up. Drake raised an eyebrow. I don't have representation, she said. I know someone. Of course you do. She picked up her coffee, found it had gone cold, set it back down. Make the call. He made the call. She listened to his half of it. Clipped, efficient, the language of people who worked in the infrastructure of accountability rather than its public face. He gave her name, her situation, the document case reference number, and then a time, 11 a.m., which was 4 hours away. He hung up. Her name is Petra Walsh. She's good. How good? She argued a case in front of the DOD Inspector General 2 years ago and won on a technicality that she'd built into the opposing counsel's own filing 6 months before they used it. Hannah looked at him. She plants traps in other people's legal arguments. She anticipates procedural vulnerabilities, but yes. He stood up, picked up the document case. I'm going to need your formal designation on record before 11. The full designation, program code, operational years, clearance tier. If I give you that, you open the file from your side, he said, voluntarily, which means it can't be weaponized against you the same way it could if someone else opens it for you. She understood the logic. She didn't like it, which was separate from whether it was correct. She picked up a pen from the counter. Drake found a clean form in the back of the case and set it on the table. She wrote her name, her real name, both of them, the one on her nursing badge and the designation she'd carried for 3 years in a program that most people in this city had never heard of and would never be told about. She signed it, she dated it, she put the pen down. And that was when her phone rang again. B.C. Afish E. Not Sato, not a blocked number. Brenda Cho, a second call in 40 minutes, which meant something had happened that couldn't wait. She answered, "What?" "Hannah." Brenda's voice was different this time, stripped of the careful, administrative neutral she'd been operating in all morning. Raw, in the way voices got when something had shifted the ground under a person fast enough that the composure hadn't caught up yet. "You need to come in." "I'm suspended, Brenda." "I know. Come in anyway." A pause, and in the pause Hannah heard what sounded like voices in the background, raised, overlapping, the particular chaos of a space that had been orderly until very recently. "There's a situation." "What kind of situation?" "Hale." The word came out with the specific weight of a stone dropped from a height. "He's here, in the hospital. He came in 20 minutes ago with 4 men and a document that he says gives him authorization to access our security records. Whitfield led him into the admin wing, and then Whitfield..." Another pause, longer this time. "Whitfield left the building. He just walked out, got in his car and drove away." Hannah was already moving toward the door. "He's going for the security footage," she said. "That's what Dr. Ellison thinks too. Ellison's trying to reach the board liaison, but he can't get through, and Hale's men are stationed at the entrance to the server room, and nobody here knows what we're legally allowed to..." "Don't let anyone into that server room," Hannah said. "Tell Ellison that. Don't let anyone in. They can waive whatever document they want. Nobody opens that door until there's a lawyer in the building." "Hannah, he's a colonel. He's a man who hit a nurse on camera and is now trying to make the camera disappear." She grabbed her jacket. 15 minutes. She hung up. Drake was already on his feet. "Server room," she said. "He's going for the footage." "I know." Drake was already pulling out his phone. "I have a contact at the federal courthouse who can get us an emergency injunction to freeze hospital records pending an official inquiry, but I need 20 minutes. "I have 15. "Then we need to move." She went out the door first. The black vehicle across the street registered her exit. She could tell by the slight shift in the window's reflection, the adjustment that living surveillance made when its subject moved. She didn't look at it directly. She walked to her car, Drake 2 steps behind her, and she pulled out of the parking space with enough deliberateness to make clear she'd seen it without making it a confrontation. They were 3 blocks from the hospital when Drake's phone rang. He answered it, listened, said almost nothing, and hung up. "What?" she said. "The document Hale brought to the hospital." He looked at the road ahead. "It's not a legal authorization to access security records. It's a letter of introduction from the base commander supporting a cooperative inquiry, which sounds official and has no actual legal force whatsoever." He's bluffing. He's been bluffing this way for years. Most of the time, nobody calls it. She pulled into the hospital lot and parked and got out of the car, and the morning air hit her, cool, faint river smell still hanging from last night, and she walked through the main entrance of North Point Regional Medical Center for the second time in 12 hours, this time with her suspended badge in her pocket and a signed classified disclosure form in the document case under Drake's arm, and she walked through the emergency department where people who had survived the night looked up as she passed, and she walked to the elevator, and she pressed the button for the 3rd floor where the administrative servers lived, behind a locked door that she had been told she was not authorized to enter. Colonel Victor Hale was standing in the hallway outside the server room door. He was flanked by 2 men in civilian clothes who had the posture of military personnel, performing a very thin impression of civilians. The server room door was closed. In front of it stood Dr. Yusuf Ellison, who was not a large man and was not especially confrontational by nature, and who was standing in front of that door with his arms loosely at his sides and the expression of someone who had decided, sometime in the last 20 minutes, exactly how much he was willing to lose over this. Hale saw Hannah coming off the elevator. Something moved through his face. Not surprise, exactly. More like recalibration, the expression of a man who had run this play successfully enough times that the appearance of a complication registered as a variable rather than a threat. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in Bay 3. The same assessment, the same calculation. She walked toward him. She stopped 6 feet away. The hallway was narrow enough that they were, essentially, alone in it despite the other bodies. Drake behind her, Ellison holding the door. The two contractor-shaped men in their practiced civilian posture. "You're not supposed to be here," Hale said. "Neither are you." "I have authorization." "You have a letter," she said, "from a base commander expressing support for a cooperative inquiry." She watched his face. "That's not the same as authorization. You know that, I know that. And in about..." She glanced at Drake. 14 minutes, Drake said. 14 minutes. A federal court contact is going to issue an emergency freeze on all hospital records pending an official inquiry into the incident that occurred in this building last night. She kept her voice at the same level she'd used in Bay 3, in the emergency department during the surge, in the supply room with Drake at 3 in the morning. Calm, precise. The register that said the person using it had already done the calculation and was now simply reporting the result. At which point, whatever is on those servers becomes evidence in a federal proceeding, and anyone who has accessed, altered, or removed that evidence between now and then becomes party to obstruction. Hale was very still. The hallway was very quiet. "You were suspended," he said. His voice had lost some of its texture. Not the tone exactly, but the absolute certainty that usually filled it the way mass fills a space. "Yes," she said. "And you struck me in an active treatment bay during a declared mass casualty event, in front of 11 direct witnesses and on 3 separate security cameras, one of which covers the hallway from a fixed angle that you cannot avoid by positioning because I know exactly where it is." She took one step closer, not aggressive, just closing the distance between performance and reality. "I know this hospital, Colonel. I know where the cameras are, I know what they record and how long the files are held and who has access to the archival system." Another step. "I spent 4 years learning every system in this building because that's what I do. I learn the systems so that when something breaks, I know exactly which part failed and why." He looked at her. For the first time since she'd seen him walk through the door of Bay 3, something in his eyes shifted that wasn't calculation. "This isn't over," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She held his gaze without blinking, without the performance of aggression, just the plain fact of a woman who had already decided she wasn't leaving this hallway. "But it's not going the direction you planned either." Drake's phone buzzed. He looked at it. "Injunctions filed," he said quietly. "Records are frozen." Hale looked at Drake for the first time. He looked at the document case, at the classified markers visible on the edge of the file protruding from the top. Something in his face completed a calculation and didn't like the answer. He turned to his men. He said nothing, just the slight tilt of the head, the directional signal of someone accustomed to being understood without words. The 2 men in their civilian postures moved back from the server room door. Hale straightened his jacket. The same small, habitual adjustment, the tug at the hem, the roll of the shoulders, that he'd made last night after the slap. Identical motion. The physical signature of a man who normalized whatever he'd just done by returning immediately to the geometry of authority. He walked toward the elevator. He passed within 4 feet of Hannah. He didn't look at her. She let him go. She stood in the hallway and let him walk past, and she watched him press the elevator button, and she watched the doors open, and she watched him step in. And in the last second before the doors closed, he turned around, not to say anything, not to deliver a parting word, but the way people turned in elevators, the automatic repositioning to face forward. His eyes met hers through the narrowing gap of the closing doors. She didn't move. The doors closed. Ellison exhaled, a long, slow, controlled breath, the exhalation of a man who had been holding something in his chest for 20 minutes. He looked at Hannah and then at Drake and then at the closed server room door, and he said nothing for a moment. "You knew about the camera angles," he said finally. "I know about all of them," she said. He absorbed that. "There are people in this hospital who watched what happened last night. What you did during the surge. He paused. And then what happened in Bay 3? People have been talking since 6 this morning. Not everyone stayed quiet. I know. I didn't, he said. Stay quiet, last night in Bay 3. He met her eyes. I know I told you already. I'm saying it again because I think it matters that I say it more than once. She looked at him. At this man who had frozen in a doorway when it mattered and was now standing in front of a server room door refusing to move. People were complicated. They failed in one moment and held in the next, and the accounting between those moments was rarely simple. It does matter, she said. You stayed in front of the door. He nodded. That was all. Drake came to stand beside her, and they both looked at the closed elevator doors. He'll regroup, Drake said quietly. This slowed him down. It didn't stop him. I know. He has resources, and he has connections, and he has people who are motivated to keep this contained. I know that too. What do you want to do? She thought about the document she'd signed this morning, about Marcus Tran and his orbital fracture and Yolanda Reyes and 2 years of spinal rehabilitation. About a room full of people who hadn't moved, and a room full of critical patients who had made it through the night, and a sealed inquiry that had been protecting the wrong people for 8 years, while the right ones adapted and buried themselves and rebuilt quietly in the margins. She picked up the document case from Drake's hand. She looked at the name on the cover, her name. I want to talk to Petra Walsh, she said, and she walked to the stairwell and she took the stairs because she didn't want to wait for the elevator, and her footsteps in the concrete stairwell were the only sound for 3 full flights. Steady, unhurried, the pace of someone who had already decided and was simply now executing. Petra Walsh was already in the building. Hannah came through the stairwell door on the ground floor and found a woman sitting in the main lobby with a laptop open and a coffee cup that had been empty long enough to leave a ring on the chair's armrest. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, compact, with the kind of stillness that suggested she'd been waiting without minding the wait because she'd been working the whole time. She looked up when Hannah came through the door and her eyes went immediately to the bruise on Hannah's cheek, not with pity, just with the specific attention of someone cataloguing relevant information. Mercer, she said, not a question. Walsh. Petra closed the laptop and stood in one motion. She was shorter than Hannah had expected, which meant nothing and which Hannah noted anyway. Drake called me at 6:15 this morning. I've been here since 7:40. She looked past Hannah to where Drake was coming through the stairwell behind her. You filed the injunction. Records are frozen, Drake confirmed. Good. That buys us. Not long. She picked up her bag and the empty coffee cup and dropped the cup in a trash can without breaking stride, already moving toward the corridor. We need a room. Private. Hospital administration or somewhere without foot traffic. Administration is compromised, Hannah said. Whitfield left the building. I heard. Conference room? Second floor has one that's rarely used before noon. Then that's where we're going. They went. The conference room on the second floor was the kind of space that existed in every institutional building. A rectangular table, 8 chairs, a whiteboard with the ghost traces of previous meetings that hadn't been fully erased. Someone had left a half-full water pitcher in the center of the table. Petra sat down, opened her laptop, and pulled a yellow legal pad from her bag with the efficiency of someone who'd set up in worse rooms under worse conditions. She looked at the document case. See, that the file? Drake set it on the table. Classified portions require your... I have clearance. She said it the way people said things that were true and didn't require elaboration. Drake already confirmed that with my firm's liaison this morning. She pulled the case toward her, clicked it open, and spent 4 minutes reading in absolute silence. Nobody spoke. Hannah sat across from her and drank the water from the pitcher because she hadn't eaten since yesterday, and her body was beginning to register a formal complaint. Drake stood by the window and looked at the parking lot. Petra turned to the last page of the classified section. She looked at it for a moment. Then she set the file down and folded her hands on top of it. Okay, she said. Here's where we are. Tell me something I don't know, Hannah said. The assault itself is clean, Petra said. Camera angle, 11 witnesses, active mass casualty event context. That's not something anyone can paper over. The question was never whether it happened. The question is what story gets built around it and how fast. She tapped the legal pad. Right now, Hale's camp is working 2 angles. 1, the conduct review against you, which establishes a counter-narrative where you were an unauthorized, suspended employee creating chaos in a critical situation, and the incident in Bay 3 was a response to that chaos rather than an unprovoked assault. "That's absurd," Ellison said. They all looked at him. He'd followed them up from the lobby and was standing in the doorway, which was either coincidence or the decision of a man who had committed to a direction and was staying in it. "Come in or don't," Petra said. "But I'm not repeating myself." Ellison came in. He sat at the end of the table. "The second angle," Petra continued, "is the sealed inquiry. Specifically, the risk that if Hale's people access that file, they're building a version of the Meridian incident that characterizes Hannah's original complaint as retaliatory. A junior program member fabricating misconduct allegations after having her assessment recommendations overridden in a legitimate command decision." Hannah looked at the table. They'd have to find someone willing to say that on record. "General Klein is retired and no longer under command jurisdiction." Petra met her eyes. "He can say whatever he wants." "Klein was there," Hannah said. "He knows what actually happened. He knows exactly what happened, which is precisely why he sealed it in the first place." Petra's voice carried no heat, just the clean, direct temperature of someone who'd spent years in rooms where facts and interests competed and had learned to distinguish between them clearly. "The question is whether his version or your version gets into the public record first, with what corroboration and in what context." Drake spoke from the window. "We have Marcus Tran." Petra looked at him. "Status?" "Medically separated, civilian, living in Carver City, about 3 hours from here. I've been in contact." He paused. "He's willing to speak. He's been willing to speak for 8 years. He needed someone to open the door." Hannah looked at Drake. She hadn't known that. Something moved through her expression that she controlled before it became visible, or thought she did, because Petra Walsh was watching her with the attention of someone who read faces professionally and missed very little. "You've been building this for a while," Hannah said to Drake, not accusatory, just placing the piece where it belonged. "The Hale file has been active for 2 years," he said. "You weren't the original focal point, but when his unit came to Ashford Ridge and you were here—" "Convergence," she said, something like that. She thought about that for a moment, about what it meant that the situation she'd walked into, the confrontation in Bay 3, the slap, the suspended badge, had not been purely random. That Victor Hale had been, in some larger architecture she hadn't been aware of, already under pressure when he walked into her emergency department and decided that she was the appropriate outlet for whatever was building in him. She didn't know how to feel about that. She filed it for later. "What do we need from me?" she said. Petra uncapped a pen. "Everything, in order. From the Meridian program onward." She positioned the legal pad. "Not the classified operational details. Those stay in the file, and I'll work from the file. I need the human record. What you observed, what you reported, what you were told, what happened to the people around you, and why you left." She looked up. "I need the version you've never given anyone officially." Hannah sat back in her chair. The chair was slightly uneven, one leg marginally shorter than the others, a mild rock that she was aware of without being bothered by it. "That's going to take more than a conference room," she said. "We have time." "Do we?" Petra glanced at Drake. He looked at his watch. "The injunction freezes hospital records for 72 hours pending review. Hale knows his window is closing. He's going to move on his next option, which means either escalating through official channels or finding another way to apply pressure," Petra finished. She looked at Hannah. "Which is why we need your statement today, not tomorrow, today." Hannah looked at the water pitcher. She looked at the legal pad, at Petra's pen, at the door that Ellison had closed behind him when he came in. She thought about the morning 8 years ago when she'd filed a complaint that had been sealed within 3 weeks, and the 6 months after that when she'd been assembling a different life from materials that were honest even if they were partial. She thought about Marcus Tran, 3 hours away in Carver City, who had been willing to speak for 8 years and needed someone to open a door. She put her hands flat on the table. "Where do you want me to start?" she said. "The field exercise," Petra said. Walk me through it." So Hannah walked her through it. She spoke for 40 minutes without stopping, and when she stopped, it was only to correct a detail, a date she'd misremembered by 2 days, a room number that she'd given correctly but wanted to verify against the file. She spoke in the specific, precise language of someone reporting what they had witnessed rather than what they had felt about it, which was its own form of emotional control, the discipline of separating observation from interpretation long enough to get the record straight. Petra wrote steadily without interrupting. Drake listened from the window. Ellison listened too. She told them about the safety assessment, completed, submitted, logged, about the protocol recommendation that had been overridden by a senior officer who had decided that timeline was more important than margin, about the sound of Marcus Tran's voice when the training breach happened, the specific quality of it that you never forgot, because it was the sound of someone whose body had been surprised by physics in a way it hadn't prepared for, about Yolanda Reyes being carried out of the facility on a stretcher, about the 48 hours of bureaucratic silence that followed, about the complaint she'd typed on a laptop in a housing unit at 11 at night and submitted through the official channel the next morning, fully documented, fully sourced. And then about the 3 weeks that came after, the way the system handled inconvenient truth, not with hostility usually, but with friction, meetings that didn't produce outcomes, responses that acknowledged receipt without confirming action, a superior officer who pulled her aside and used the word optics in a context that made clear he thought the problem was the complaint rather than what the complaint described. He said, she paused, reached back into a memory she'd kept boxed for a long time. He said that a formal finding against the program at that stage would cost us 3 years of institutional credibility, that the people I was trying to protect would be better served by a quiet internal correction than a formal process. She looked at the table. I asked him what the quiet internal correction looked like. He said they'd review the safety protocols. And did they? Petra asked. The protocols were reviewed by a subcommittee that reported to the same officer who'd overridden them. Hannah looked up. So no. Petra made a note. What happened to the original complaint? Reclassified as a procedural grievance, the distinction matters. A formal complaint of misconduct goes into a permanent file. A procedural grievance gets reviewed and closed within the fiscal year. Mine was closed as resolved 6 weeks after I filed it. She paused. The resolution noted that safety protocols had been reviewed. By the subcommittee that reported to Klein. Yes. Petra underlined something on the legal pad. And then you left. And then I left. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, the hospital moved. They could hear it through the walls, the ambient sound of a building continuing its business regardless of what was happening in the second-floor conference room. That persistence was either comforting or absurd, depending on your current relationship with institutions, and Hannah's relationship with institutions had always been complicated. I have a question, Ellison said. Everyone looked at him. He'd been silent for 40 minutes, which Hannah had been peripherally aware of. The quality of his silence was attentive rather than uncomfortable. The silence of someone taking things in rather than waiting for a gap to speak. The triage system you ran last night, he said. The zone framework, the team assignments, the communication structure. He paused. That wasn't nursing school. No, she said. Where did it come from? She looked at him. Meridian developed a mass casualty response framework for forward operating environments. Small teams, limited resources, high decision pressure. The framework was designed to be deployable by personnel without traditional medical command structure, to flatten hierarchy fast enough to actually function in chaos. She paused. I ran a modified version last night, adapted for a civilian hospital setting. It worked, he said. I know. I've been a physician for 16 years, he said. I've worked 3 mass casualty responses. Last night was the first time I've seen a department actually function the way the training says it should. He looked at the table and then back at her. And it was run by a suspended nurse. Yes? That's going to be part of the public record, Petra said without looking up from the legal pad. Along with the patient outcomes, 4 critical patients, all stable, in a department that by all accounts was approaching system failure when Mercer arrived. She made another note. The conduct review Whitfield filed this morning is going to have a very difficult time characterizing last night as interference. Whitfield left the building, Drake said. His departure is on the hospital's external security camera. Timestamp is 7:53 a.m. Is that significant? Ellison asked. He left 12 minutes after Hale arrived. Drake turned from the window, which suggests coordination, which suggests that Whitfield's role in this is not simply an administrator making a bad decision under pressure. It suggests an ongoing relationship with Hale's operation that predates last night. The room absorbed that. Ellison looked like a man who was recalibrating something he'd previously understood as simple. Whitfield has been the administrator here for 3 years, he said slowly. He came from a regional network. There were people on the hiring committee who... He stopped. The board connection, Hannah said. I don't know the details, he shook his head, but there were people on the hiring committee who came from that network, yes. I remember thinking at the time that the process felt predetermined. Petra looked at him over the legal pad. Dr. Ellison, are you willing to make a statement to that effect? He blinked. Yes, if it's relevant. Everything is relevant until it isn't. She wrote his name at the top of a new page. We'll get to you after we finish with Mercer. Hannah watched Ellison's face process that. The slight adjustment, the recalibration of what he'd walked into when he followed them upstairs. He'd committed to a direction in front of a server room door, and the direction was continuing further than he'd originally mapped. She could see him deciding whether to revise the commitment, and then deciding not to. That, too, was a kind of accounting between moments of failure and moments of holding. Her phone buzzed on the table. She looked at it. Unknown number, third different one in 12 hours. She answered. Mercer. Silence for 2 seconds. Then a voice she didn't immediately recognize. Low, male, slightly hoarse, with the careful diction of someone choosing words with intention. You don't know me, the voice said. My name is Sergeant First Class David Okafor. Retired. I served under Hale's command at Fort Regan in 2019. She went very still. I heard what happened, Okafor said. In the hospital. It's been on the news since 6 this morning. A pause. I've been sitting on something for 5 years. I wasn't sure there was any point in coming forward because every time someone tried before, it went nowhere. Another pause, longer. But when I saw your name this morning, what you did during the bridge response, and then the review they're filing against you. Mr. Okafor, she said. Her voice was steady. Can you hold for 30 seconds? Yes. She put the phone on the table and looked at Petra. Retired Army Sergeant. Says he served under Hale at Fort Regan in 2019. Petra's pen stopped moving. That's the location of the civilian contractor complaint, Drake said from the window. The one that was reclassified as an equipment incident. Petra looked at Hannah. Put him on speaker. She put the phone on speaker and set it on the table between them. Mr. Okafor, she said, I'm putting you on speaker. I have my legal representative and a colleague present. Is that acceptable? Yes. Thank you for calling. Please continue. The sound of a breath. In March of 2019, I witnessed Colonel Hale physically assault a civilian contractor named Sylvia Park during a site inspection at Fort Regan. She had disagreed with him in front of his staff about a facility safety assessment. He hit her. A pause. Not the same as what happened to you. She had bruising on her forearm where he grabbed her and twisted, but she filed a complaint. I know because I was one of 2 people who she told she was going to file. What happened to the complaint? Petra asked. 72 hours later, she retracted it, said she'd decided it was a misunderstanding. His voice carried the specific flatness of someone recounting something they'd considered from many angles and had never been able to fully square. I saw her once after that. She wouldn't talk to me. She transferred off the project within a month. And you? Hannah asked. I was encouraged to let it go, he said, by my company commander. The encouragement was very clear about what letting it go looked like and what not letting it go would cost me. A pause. I let it go. I've thought about that a lot in the last 5 years. The conference room was very quiet. Mr. Okafor, Petra said, are you willing to give a formal statement to that effect, on record with your name attached? A beat of silence. That's why I called. Petra wrote his name on a new page. She wrote it carefully, pressing firmly enough that Hannah could see the impression it made in the paper. Someone will contact you within the hour, Petra said. Don't speak to anyone else until they do. Don't post anything. Don't respond to media inquiries if you receive them. She paused. And Mr. Okafor, thank you. Don't thank me yet, he said. Thank me if it works. He hung up. The room held the silence for a moment before Drake broke it. That's 3 sources, he said. You, Tran, Okafor. With Ellison's statement about the administrative hiring process and the security footage and the patient outcome data from last night. It's enough to compel the inquiry, Petra said. She was already typing. It's not a verdict, but it's enough to force the question into a venue where it can't be administratively closed in 72 hours. Klein, Hannah said. Everyone looked at her. Hale's insulation goes through Klein, she said. If Klein holds, the network holds. The inquiry gets complicated and slow and expensive, and eventually some version of a finding comes out that's technically critical but practically toothless. She looked at Petra. Has anyone spoken to Klein directly? Petra and Drake exchanged a look. I spoke to his attorney 8 months ago, Drake said. As part of the original Hale file development, he was unresponsive. 8 months ago you had a file, Hannah said. Now you have 3 witnesses, a federal injunction, security footage, and a mass casualty response that's been on regional news since this morning with my name attached to it. She looked at Drake steadily. Call his attorney again. He won't. He will or he won't, she said. But the calculation changed last night, and Klein is old enough and smart enough to know when the math changes. She picked up the water pitcher and refilled her glass. The people who protect men like Hale don't do it out of loyalty. They do it because the protection costs less than the alternative. She set the pitcher down. Change the cost of the alternative. Drake looked at her for a long moment, then he picked up his phone. He stepped out of this conference room to make the call. Petra kept typing. Ellison looked at the table and then at Hannah with the expression of a man who had been slowly understanding, over the course of the last 3 hours, that the woman he'd worked beside for 4 years without fully seeing was not who he'd assumed she was. Which was not her fault exactly, since she'd built the assumption carefully. But the understanding was arriving nonetheless, and it was visibly changing something in the way he held himself. Can I ask you something? He said. You can ask. Why nursing? He said it without condescension. Not why just nursing, but the genuine question. After everything you'd built in Meridian, the framework, the protocols, the program work, why come here and triage patients and change IV bags and work night shifts for hospital rates? She looked at him. Because it's true work. Because every decision I make has an immediate, visible consequence. Because nobody in an emergency department cares about your clearance level or your program designation. They care whether you know what you're doing and whether you show up. She paused. And because the work I did before cost me things I didn't get back. And I needed to find out if I could do the same thing in a context that wasn't... She stopped. That wasn't trying to use me. He was quiet. I liked it, she said. And the simplicity of it seemed to surprise her slightly. I like this job. I like this department. I like Gerald Avery's morning arrhythmia and Campos when he stops shaking, and the way the night shift smells at 3 a.m. She looked at the table. I wasn't hiding. I was just here. The door opened. Drake came back in. He set his phone on the table face down, the gesture of someone putting something completed aside. Everyone waited. Klein's attorney called back in 11 minutes, he said, which is faster than the last conversation by a factor of about 6 months. And? Petra said. And General Klein is willing to speak with the inquiry team. Drake sat down. Voluntarily. On the record. A pause. He has, apparently, some things he'd like to clarify about the events of 8 years ago. The room absorbed that. Hannah looked at the document case on the table, at her name on the cover, both names now, the nurse and the other one, the designation she'd signed onto a form this morning in her kitchen, while an unknown car sat outside and a bruise developed on her face. He's moving to the other side, Petra said quietly. The math changed, Hannah said. Drake looked at her. You knew he would. I thought he might. She straightened in her chair. Men like Klein don't protect men like Hale because they believe in them. They protect them because it's the cheapest available option. She looked at the legal pad, at Okafor's name and Tran's name and her own name written in Petra's careful hand. When it stops being the cheapest option, they find another calculation, Drake finished. Yes. Petra looked up from the laptop. I need 3 more hours from both of you. She looked between Hannah and Drake. Then I'm filing the formal inquiry request. Once that's in, we're in federal process. No more administrative maneuvering, no more conduct reviews, no more Whitfield making calls in the middle of the night. She paused. No more black vehicles outside your apartment either. Operating that kind of surveillance on a person who's a named party in an active federal inquiry would be very inadvisable, Drake said. Catastrophically inadvisable. Petra turned back to the laptop. So, 3 hours, let's go. Hannah pulled her chair closer to the table. She looked at the legal pad, at the names and dates and the accumulated record of what had actually happened in rooms where power had expected silence and gotten something else. Outside the conference room, the hospital continued its business. The business of keeping people alive, which was true work, which had consequences you could see, which didn't lie about what it was. She thought about Gerald Avery's chart. She hoped the cardiology consult had happened. She made a mental note to check. Then Petra asked the next question and Hannah answered it, and the work of the morning continued. Not smoothly, not perfectly, with interruptions and corrections, and one moment around the 10 o'clock hour when Drake said something that required Hannah to stop and look at the window for 30 seconds before she could continue. But forward. Always forward. The 3 hours Petra had asked for turned into 4.5. Nobody commented on it. The water pitcher got emptied and refilled twice. Ellison left at noon to cover a shift that couldn't be postponed and came back at 2:15 with sandwiches from the cafeteria that nobody had asked for and everyone ate without acknowledging. Drake's phone rang 6 times during the session, and he stepped out for each call and came back with new information that Petra absorbed without breaking the rhythm of her questioning, adding pages to the legal pad and entries to the laptop with the systematic efficiency of someone constructing something that needed to hold weight. Hannah talked until her voice felt worn at the edges. She had not talked this much about this material in 8 years. She talked around it, to herself, in the particular late-night internal accounting that everyone did when the lights were off and the day was over, and the mind went to the places it avoided during waking hours. But talking around something and talking through it were different operations, and the difference was physical, she discovered, a specific fatigue in the chest that had nothing to do with the hours or the food or the previous sleepless night. By 2:30, Petra had what she needed. She closed the legal pad and saved the document on her laptop, and sat back in her chair and rubbed the bridge of her nose with 2 fingers. The first purely human gesture Hannah had seen from her in 4 hours. The inquiry request goes in at 3, Petra said. Once it's filed, the federal process owns this. Hale's camp will know within the hour. His attorney will file a response, probably within 24 hours, and then it becomes about the record. She looked at Hannah. Your record, all of it. The program, the complaint, last night. All of it is in the public document now. I understand. It's going to be in the news. I understand that too. There will be people who try to find the version of you that's smaller than what the record actually shows. That's how these things work. They'll look for inconsistencies, personal history, anything that reframes the narrative. Petra held her gaze. I need you to be prepared for that, and I need you to not react to it in any public forum, including social media, which I'm going to ask you not to use at all during this process. I don't use social media. Petra blinked once. That will make this easier, she paused. There's one more thing. The hospital board is meeting this evening, emergency session. The bridge response has been on regional news, and the story about what happened in Bay 3 is starting to pick up traction. 3 of the witnesses from Bay 3 have given statements to a journalist at the Ashford Ridge Tribune. I don't know what's in those statements yet. Who are the 3 witnesses? Hannah asked. Drake checked his phone. 2 nurses and a patient family member who was in the hallway adjacent to Bay 3. He looked up. The family member is a retired school teacher named Carolyn Voss. Apparently she was very clear about what she saw. Hannah thought about the hallway outside Bay 3. She hadn't registered a civilian in the hallway. She'd been focused on the cart, on Gerald Avery's monitor, on the specific dimensions of the situation in front of her. But the hallway had been accessible. People moved through it. A retired school teacher waiting for news about someone she loved would have had every reason to be standing there at that hour. She hadn't been alone. She just hadn't known it. The board meeting, Petra said, pulling the room back. They'll be discussing the administrator situation, the incident, and the hospital's liability exposure. I'd like you to be available if they want to speak with you. I'm suspended, Hannah said. You're suspended by an administrator who left the building at 7:53 this morning and hasn't been reachable since. The board hasn't ratified the suspension. Technically, Petra paused, and for the first time something that was almost a smile moved through her expression. Technically, the suspension is on shaky procedural ground. Hannah looked at her. I know, Petra said. I'm going to enjoy that part. At 3:07 p.m., the inquiry request was filed. Hannah was sitting in the conference room when Drake got the confirmation on his phone and turned the screen toward her without saying anything. She looked at the case number, at her name in the document header, at the timestamp. Then she stood up, picked up her jacket and said, I need some air. She took the stairs down to the ground floor. and went out through a side exit that led out into the small courtyard between the main building and the parking structure, a space with 3 concrete benches and a tree that someone had planted years ago, and that had grown at a slight angle because of the shadow cast by the structure. It was not a beautiful courtyard. It was the kind of outdoor space that existed primarily to give hospital staff somewhere to stand outside without being in the parking lot. She sat on one of the concrete benches. The afternoon had gone warm. September in Ashford Ridge did that. Morning cold, afternoon warm, the season not yet committed to itself. She could smell the river again, faint, carrying across the city from the east where the Greystone ran and where, somewhere along its bank, the debris of the collapsed bridge was still being catalogued by engineering teams. She sat there for 9 minutes. She knew, because she counted, not deliberately, just the automatic counting that happened when you were a person accustomed to timing things. Then she went back inside. The board meeting was at 6. She used the intervening time to check on Gerald Avery, who was in the cardiac care unit on the 4th floor, awake, irritable about the diet restrictions, and, by all indicators, likely to make a full recovery. She stood in the doorway of his room, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who had been told he'd been treated by someone who was simultaneously suspended and running the whole department. "You look tired," he said. "You look alive," she said. He made a sound that was approximately a laugh. "Doc says I've got the heart of a 50-year-old. Doc is being generous. Doc said 60, I'm adjusting." He looked at her with the particular directness of someone who had been recently close enough to dying that small considerations had temporarily lost their grip. "Heard about what happened to you in the bay downstairs. News travels. Hospital news travels faster." He shifted against the pillow. "That the man who hit you, that colonel?" "Yes." "I was in that bed," he said. "Wasn't conscious for most of it, they tell me. But I was in that bed." He looked at the window and then back at her. "I want you to know I'm grateful for what you did. Not just last night, all of it." She looked at him. 62 years old, cantankerous, alive. "Get some rest, Gerald," she said, "and eat the diet food. It's not negotiable." He made the sound again. She walked away down the hall. The board meeting started at 6, and Hannah was not in the room when it began. She was in the corridor outside the boardroom on the 5th floor, sitting on a bench that existed for waiting, which was what she was doing. Drake was beside her. He'd been beside her, she realized, for most of the day. Not hovering, not crowding, just present with the steady, undemonstrative presence of someone who understood that certain situations required a person to not be entirely alone, and who was fulfilling that function without making a performance of it. At 6:47, the boardroom door opened and a woman in her early 60s came out. She was the board chair. Hannah knew her face from the annual hospital newsletter, which she'd never read thoroughly but had registered peripherally. Eleanor Marsh, formerly a healthcare attorney, currently the chair of the largest hospital board in the county, with the kind of composed, direct demeanor that suggested she'd been in difficult rooms before and had not found them especially diminishing. She looked at Hannah. "Ms. Mercer," she said, "we'd like you to come in." Hannah stood up. She looked at Drake. He nodded once, not encouragingly, just acknowledging. She went in. The boardroom had 12 people in it. Hannah recognized 2 of them, Dr. Ellison, who was present as a department representative, and Richard Sato, Whitfield's legal counsel, who was sitting at the far end of the table with the careful expression of a man who understood the meeting was not going the direction his client had designed. She sat in the chair Marsh indicated. "We've reviewed the security footage from last night," Marsh said. "All 3 camera angles. We've read the triage log and the patient outcome data. We've spoken with 6 members of the emergency department staff." She folded her hands on the table. "The conduct review filed this morning by Administrator Whitfield has been suspended pending review of the circumstances of its filing." Sato shifted slightly. "The board has also been briefed on the federal inquiry filed this afternoon," Marsh continued, "and on the nature of Administrator Whitfield's departure from the building this morning and his relationship with the individual who is the subject of that inquiry." "Former administrator," said one of the board members, a man named Gant, according to the nameplate, who had the look of someone who'd been in finance before healthcare and processed institutional problems with the language of exposure and liability. "We haven't formally," another member began. "The resignation was emailed at 4:17 p.m., Marsh said. "Legal has confirmed its validity." She looked at Hannah. Ms. Mercer, I want to ask you something directly. All right. In your assessment, as someone who has worked in this department for 4 years and who ran its emergency response during last night's mass casualty event, what is the most significant systemic failure that the events of the last 24 hours have exposed? The room waited. Hannah thought about the question. It was a real question, not rhetorical, not designed to lead somewhere predetermined. Marsh wanted an actual answer. Culture of deference, Hannah said. The department watched something happen in Bay 3 and nobody moved. Not because they didn't know it was wrong. Because the cost of responding felt higher than the cost of staying quiet. She looked at the table. That's not a personnel problem. That's a structural problem. It means that somewhere in this institution's design, people learned that speaking up had consequences and silence didn't. She looked at Marsh. The same structure that let Colonel Hale walk out of this building without challenge is the same structure that let a triage system fail during a mass casualty event because nobody felt authorized to organize it. She paused. Those are the same problem. The room was quiet. What would you change? Marsh asked. Policy is the beginning, not the solution, Hannah said. You can rewrite the incident reporting protocol and post it on every wall in the building, and it won't change anything if the underlying culture says that using the protocol costs you something. She thought about Okafor, 3 hours away, who had held something for 5 years, because letting it go had been the cheaper option. You change the cost calculation. You make it demonstrably, consistently safer to speak than to stay quiet. And you do that by doing it, by making the first case that tests the policy an example that actually holds. Marsh looked at her for a moment. We'd like to offer you a position, she said, Director of Emergency Preparedness. The role would involve both clinical oversight and systemic review, protocol design, staff training, incident response architecture. She paused. It would also, in practice, give you the institutional standing to make the changes you just described. Hannah looked at her. She looked at Gant, who was watching her with the careful neutrality of someone who hadn't voted for this and hadn't voted against it. She looked at Ellison, who met her gaze with an expression that was neither pushing nor pulling, just present, the same way he'd been present in front of the server room door. I'm still a party in an active federal inquiry, she said. We're aware. The inquiry concerns events that directly involve this hospital's administrative structure. We're aware of that too. Marsh held her gaze. The board's position is that the inquiry is not a liability. It's a process that this institution should be actively supporting, not managing around. A pause. We've spent the last 4 hours reaching that conclusion. It wasn't unanimous at first. Gant looked at the table. It is now, Marsh said. Hannah looked at the window. The Ashford Ridge evening was settling into its particular gradient, the light coming down, the city switching registers from day to night. Somewhere out there, the Greystone River still running, still carrying the week's history in its current. She thought about the work, the actual work, not the designation or the clearance or the program code, not the inquiry or the legal process or the bruise on her face that was going to take another week to fully fade. The work of keeping people alive, the work that was just true, that had immediate visible consequences, that didn't lie about what it was. I'll need to finish my shifts, she said. Marsh blinked. I'm sorry? I have patience. Gerald Avery's cardiology follow-up is tomorrow. Campos, one of the first-year residents, he's going to need to debrief the bridge response properly. Otherwise, he'll carry it wrong. She looked at Marsh. Before I take any administrative role, I need to finish what's in front of me. Marsh looked at her for a long moment. Of course, she said. Hannah nodded once. Then yes. The formal charging documents against Colonel Victor Hale were filed by the federal inquiry 11 days later. The charges encompassed the assault in Bay 3, the unauthorized access attempt at the hospital server room, and a pattern of misconduct across 4 installations spanning 6 years. General Arthur Klein provided a voluntary statement that described, in the careful, specific language of a man who had decided that personal liability was the more relevant consideration, the events of the Meridian Field exercise and the decision to seal the subsequent inquiry. His statement corroborated Hannah's complaint in every material detail. Marcus Tran gave his statement by video from Carver City and was, by all accounts, completely composed throughout. David Okafor flew to Ashford Ridge and gave his in person. The Ashford Ridge Tribune ran the story across 3 days. Regional outlets picked it up. National outlets picked it up from regional. A journalist named Kayla Frost wrote a piece that focused not on the assault itself, but on the night of the bridge response, on the 63 patients and the 4 critical survivors and the triage system that had held a drowning department together, and on the woman who had been suspended 2 hours before she walked back into the building and ran it anyway. The piece did not describe Hannah as extraordinary. It described what she had done in specific factual terms and let the reader carry the weight of that. She read it once, in the break room, on a Wednesday afternoon between shifts, on someone else's phone because she didn't follow the news coverage and had been avoiding it deliberately. She handed the phone back when she was done. "Well," said the nurse who'd handed it to her, a second year named Torres who had been in the department the night of the bridge response and had been one of the first people to follow Hannah's zone assignments without question. "It's accurate," Hannah said. "That's all you're going to say." "What else is there to say?" Torres looked at her. Most people would say something more than that. Most people weren't there. She picked up the chart she'd been reviewing. "Table 4 needs a redress on that laceration. Can you get to it before the next intake?" Torres went to table 4. Hannah went back to the chart. The board hearing that formally established Hale's case for military tribunal happened on a Thursday morning in late October. Hannah was not present. She was in the emergency department covering a morning shift because there were patients and there was work, and the work did not pause for the things that were happening in other rooms. Drake called her at 11:15. She stepped out of the department into the corridor to take it. "It's done," he said. "The tribunal date is set. His command authority has been suspended pending the proceeding." She leaned against the corridor wall. "Klein?" Klein received a formal censure and was removed from both advisory board positions. His statement was taken into consideration as a mitigating factor. A pause. "He won't face charges." "I know." She'd known that was how it would resolve. She didn't like it, which was separate from accepting it. And she'd done both some time ago, because the alternative was letting the imperfection of the outcome become a reason to discount what had been accomplished, which was the oldest trap in the process. "Mercer." Drake's voice changed slightly. Not softer, but less clipped, the cadence of someone who'd stepped outside the professional register for a moment. "How are you?" She considered the question. "I'm working," she said. "Is that an answer?" "It's the true one." She looked down the corridor at the emergency department doors, through which she could see Torres moving between bays, with the particular efficiency of someone who'd started finding their stride. "I'm working, and the work is good, and the department is better than it was." She paused. "There are still problems. The culture doesn't change because you file an inquiry. It changes because you show up every day and make different decisions than the day before, and it's slow. And sometimes it goes backward and then you correct and keep going." "Sounds familiar." "It's the only way anything actually changes." She pushed off the wall. "Thank you, Drake." "For what specifically?" "For coming in that helicopter," she said, "and for buying coffee on the way to my apartment." A brief pause. She could hear him almost smile through it. "Take care of yourself," he said. "I'm working on it." She went back into the department. The ceremony honouring the bridge response was held in the first week of November, in the hospital's main atrium. Not a grand space, not intended for events, with the acoustic issues of any large room that hadn't been designed for speeches, and the smell of industrial carpet that no amount of flower arrangements fully concealed. The families of bridge survivors came. Some of the survivors themselves came, including a man in a wheelchair who had been one of the 4 critical patients and who crossed the room to find Hannah specifically, and stood up from the wheelchair to shake her hand, and didn't say anything, and didn't need to. The board spoke, Marsh spoke, a city council member spoke. Then someone introduced Hannah, and she walked to the front of the room and stood at the podium and looked at the faces in front of her, families, staff, the nurses who had run zone assignments at 2 in the morning, Ellison in the 3rd row with his arms crossed, and an expression she'd learned to read as something between respect and the specific discomfort of a man still reckoning with himself. Torres, in the back, still in scrubs, because she'd come straight from a shift and hadn't had time to change. Hannah had prepared remarks. She'd written them on a Tuesday evening, 3 drafts, read them aloud to the empty apartment, decided they were approximately right. She looked at the room and put the remarks aside. "I'm not good at this part," she said. A few people laughed, a small, genuine sound, the laugh of recognition. The talking about it instead of doing it. She looked at the families. What happened on the night of the bridge response was not exceptional. Not in the way that word usually gets used. She paused. What was exceptional was that it was documented, that there were cameras and witnesses and an outcome record that was clear enough that people couldn't look away from it. She looked at the staff along the walls, the nurses and techs and residents who had run through a drowning department in the middle of the night, following instructions from a woman whose badge was suspended and whose face was bruised. The staff in this department do this work every shift, without a news story, without a ceremony. She stopped. They deserved a room like this a long time before I walked back through those doors. She stepped back from the podium. The room came to its feet. She stood there and let it happen, and she didn't look at the ceiling or at the floor. She looked at the room, at the faces, at Torres in the back in her scrubs with her hands raised like everyone else, at Ellison who had unfolded his arms and was standing with the rest of them. She didn't cry, she wasn't built for it in public, and she'd made her peace with that about herself years ago. But something shifted, something she'd been carrying for a long time, not quite grief and not quite the weight of what had been done wrong, but the specific exhaustion of having known your own worth clearly and fully while standing in rooms that didn't, and having kept going anyway, because the alternative was to stop being who you were. That weight, standing in the atrium with the applause of a room that had finally caught up, shifted. Not lifted entirely. Things didn't work that way, and she knew it, and she wouldn't have believed anyone who told her otherwise. But shifted, redistributed, became, for the first time in a long time, something she could carry differently. She walked back to her seat. She had an early shift tomorrow. The Director of Emergency Preparedness role came with fewer direct patient hours, but she'd negotiated to keep 2 shifts a week in the department because she'd meant what she said to Ellison in the conference room. She liked the work, the actual work, the part where the decisions had weight, and the consequences were visible, and you couldn't pretend something was fine when the monitors said otherwise. Torres was waiting for her at the edge of the atrium after the ceremony, still in scrubs, cup of coffee from somewhere. "That was good," Torres said. "What you said up there. I meant it. I know." Torres handed her the coffee. Not her own, a separate one she'd gotten for Hannah without being asked. "Gerald Avery called the department this morning, by the way. Is he all right?" "He's fine. He wanted to complain about the cardiology diet and also ask if you were going to be on his follow-up." Torres paused. "I said I'd check." Hannah wrapped both hands around the cup. "Tell him yes," she said. Some things took years to break open. Some things broke open in a single night, in a single room, in the 2.8 seconds it took for a powerful man to make the mistake of believing that the woman in front of him had no ground to stand on. She had always had ground. She had simply been the only one standing on it. The truth about extraordinary people is not that they arrive extraordinary. It's that they persist ordinary in the face of everything that tells them to diminish. They show up. They do the work. They hold the door. And they keep going long before anyone else decides to notice. Real strength doesn't announce itself. It just keeps showing up until the room has no choice but to see.